Hey everyone, and welcome back to No Sleep Theater, The Collector's Vault. I'm your host, DB Keebler, The Collector. Today we have for you a bonus video. Recently, we discovered an odd chain of events being reported by different people. This all seems to be related to a video we posted a few months back containing the story Sleepover by Roozea. So today, we're going to revisit the story, and over the next few weeks, we'll be bringing you the reports of these other incidents. And don't forget, if you enjoyed tonight's video, show your support by pressing a like and subscribing. It's a simple step that helps the channel out a lot.
Sleepover by Reddit user Roozea. My buddy, Jake we'll call him, is 18 and still lives with his parents. He'd been complaining for days now about some assholes who had taken to hanging around his house every night.
Just call the cops if it bothers you.
Another of my pals, Tony, advised him.
My dad's telling me not to bother. Says they aren't harming anybody and to just leave them to it. But it freaks me out the way they just keep glancing at our windows. Would you guys come stay over at my place while my folks are away?
There were sniggers from many in the group. I remember the word pussy being thrown around a lot. Myself and Tony took pity and agreed to stay with him. Jake's parents frequently took trips out of town, making his place the usual party venue. On this particular occasion, they were going to be gone a week, starting Saturday. Saturday came along. I threw some supplies in a bag and drove to Jake's house, picking up Tony along the way. The relief on Jake's face when he opened the door to greet us showed how much the shit was getting to him.
I take it they haven't stopped?
It had been 2 days since we last spoke. He just shook his head. We spent the rest of the day drinking beer, playing Xbox, and teasing Jake.
They probably just want a better look at your mom, dude. Can hardly blame them.
Earned Tony a punch in the arm. We were all enjoying ourselves, but I couldn't help but notice Jake nervously peeking out the window from time to time. By the time the sun had set, we were all pretty drunk, giggling like schoolgirls over nothing in particular, when all of a sudden Jake fell silent. I followed his gaze out the living room window to see 3 hooded figures standing motionless in the street. None of us had seen them approach. Tony, still giggling, received a small nudge. He too fell silent. I was the first to speak.
Okay, I can see why they creep you out.
We watched them for a good 5 minutes, while their silhouettes watched us. They hadn't moved an inch in this time.
They haven't done that before.
Tony rose from the table. We had been playing cards prior to their appearance, and walked over to the light switch. A small click and we were plunged into the darkness. We kept watching. So did they.
Okay, fuck this.
Fueled by booze, Jake rose from the table and stormed over to the front door, wrenched it open and yelled,
The fuck are you creeps staring at?
No reply, but their heads moved as one to stare at Jake on the doorstep.
Guys,
Jake shouted back at us.
call the cops.
Tony grabbed the house phone and dialed 911, but as he did so, Jake's voice came again.
Guys, call the cops.
Only it didn't come from Jake. The figure that spoke in my friend's voice then started walking straight towards Jake, standing on the doorstep. Its movements were totally unnatural, ridiculous even. If the situation hadn't been so tense, we might have laughed our asses off. As it was, we were terrified. Its arms hung loosely by its sides, swinging limp like a pendulum. Its legs moved in short, jerky movements, and the head just rolled and rolled around the neck, and it was quick. Jake yelled out in fear as he stumbled back through the doorway, the figure almost on top of him as he slammed the door with all his might and yanked the deadbolt across.
Guys, call the cops.
Came the voice from the other side of the door.
I need the police. This is an emergency.
Tony's trembling voice came out in the darkness and proceeded to explain the situation as well as he could. After telling them the address, they told Tony to stay on the line and that the car was on its way. The voice on the other side of the door stopped repeating itself. Now, I've read a lot of horror stories in my time. I know this is something of a cliche, but I shit you not, the thing started laughing so hard you could hear it struggling for breath. And if I hadn't been scared before then, I fucking was now. Part 2. All of a sudden, there was silence. The creature stopped laughing. The only sound left came from the phone Tony still held to his ear. Jake's house is on the outskirts of a small town. We had been told it would be at least 10 minutes before the nearest squad car would reach us. The quiet was awful. Truth be told, I actually preferred the laughter. We could still see the two figures watching us from the street, but we had lost any indication of the other's whereabouts.
The back door is locked, right?
I whispered to Jake. Even in the darkness, I saw his eyes widen in response. Our eyes snapped to the back door, visible through the kitchen, as the handle began to turn. That horrible laugh reverberated once again through the house as the door burst open, and the figure filled the doorway. Light from the kitchen illuminated the thing's now hoodless head. It had awful dark eyes and wore an ear-to-ear grin to go along with that insane laugh. Its head still rolling around in that fucked up way, with its gaze never leaving Jake, who was standing frozen beside me. Apart from the exaggerated mouth and dark, sunken eyes, it was the splitting image of my friend.
The fuck are you creeps staring at?
Came a scream from Jake's doppelganger, in a perfect imitation of his earlier outbursts, its voice filled with mirth. We snapped from our trances and sprinted from the living room. The phone clattered against the wall as Tony dropped it like a hot potato. Nobody looked back as we raced up the stairs and piled into the small bathroom, the only other room with a lock. After the room was secure, we each backed away from the door until our legs touched the bathtub. Jake was pale, muttering to himself.
What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck?
Over and over again under his breath. Tony looked over at me.
Should we try to fight?
He was interrupted by an earth-shaking boom. The bolt rattled violently but held as the creature repeatedly threw its weight against the door. It's hard to accurately describe my feelings in that moment. It was the first time I'd ever experienced absolute dread. Paralyzed by fear, eyes filled with hopeless tears, I'm ashamed to admit that I did nothing as the first few shards splintered from the door. It wouldn't take much more. The giggling intensified as the door weakened, Tony frantically searching the bathroom for a makeshift weapon, while Jake's sobbing grew louder along with the distant sirens. Sirens? A small bubble of hope began to swell within me as the creature ceased its attempts to break down the door. There was a loud knock from the downstairs, followed by a commanding voice.
This is the police. We received an emergency call from this address.
Believe me, I wanted to yell, to scream for help, but fear of what this thing might do constricted my throat. Thankfully, my friends remained silent too.
Open this door immediately or I will have to force entry.
After a short pause, a merry voice outside the bathroom called downstairs.
Oh, there's no need for that, officer. We're all fine.
Shit. The bubble burst. It sounded as though the creature was skipping downstairs as it continued to assure the policeman that there was nothing wrong, all in a perfect imitation of Jake. Seizing an ounce of courage, Tony slowly made his way back to the bathroom door and slid the bolt back across.
What are you doing?
I mouthed to him. He just ushered for us to follow as he carefully opened the door, silently cursing every creak. He was the first to reach the top of the stairs and look down. Horror etched across his face. Reaching the landing, I looked to see the creature standing with its back to the front door, facing the stairs, speaking casually with the policeman on the other side, head still rolling with that big-ass grin spread across its features. Its eyes immediately flicked to Jake as he appeared at my shoulder. It slowly raised an arm and pressed a finger to its lips.
Turns out it was just a prank for some guys I know from work.
It never removed its gaze from Jake.
They apologized when I confronted them, saying,
Jake screamed in a sudden fit of hysteria.
"We're up here! Help us! That isn't me!"
With that, the creature's head snapped to a somewhat normal position, any trace of that terrifying joy now gone. Pure hatred contorted the lines of its face, eyes boring deep into Jake as it took a step towards us with murderous intent. With an ear-splitting crash, the door burst open and a huge man spilled into the hall. The creature took one look behind and disappeared in a blur, back through the living room. Seconds later, the back door slammed shut with an almighty force. Horror and confusion fought for control of the officer's features as he observed the three of us huddled atop the stairs. His gaze lingered on Jake, no doubt noticing the resemblance to what he had just seen.
There are 2 more in the street.
Came Tony's weak voice from by my shoulder. A few days later, we left protective custody. The police officer who likely saved our lives swore blind that we were telling the truth, having got a good look at the thing's unearthly face. They had found no real leads, so the search was called off as they had real investigations to allocate resources to. Jake returned home to his parents. They'd chosen to stay home after returning early from their trip, and Tony and I went our separate ways. The weeks following, we texted each other constantly. Any small bump in the night would spur us into calling the others, the paranoia getting to us all, so it struck us odd when Jake stopped returning our calls. For days we heard nothing at all from our friend, so we headed to his house as we had countless times before. His front door swung open before we had a chance to knock. We were greeted by Jake smiling warmly at us, his parents appearing behind him shortly after.
Hey guys, it's great to see you. Would you like to come in? Mom's just finished making dinner.
His mom smiled down at us, nodding in agreement. We politely declined, saying we were glad he was okay and just worried. As we rushed back down the path, I took one last look through Jake's window, from the very spot the figures had stood tormenting us. He was there with his parents, watching as we sped away. Their wide eyes followed us, grins spread wide across their faces, with their heads rolling sickeningly in unison. That final image still haunts me to this day. Before we move on to the conclusion of tonight's tale, a reminder that if you're enjoying this video and want to see more like it, press the like and subscribe. Part 3.
Do you think he's still alive? Maybe they need him and his family alive for something. Maybe they're keeping them somewhere. We can't just sit here doing nothing.
I listened as Tony rambled on, as he did nigh on every day, about his grand plans to save Jake and his family. Tony practically lived at my place by now, which suited me perfectly. As much as I despise admitting it, the whole thing had me terrified of my own shadow. People at work thought I was going insane, and I was told to take a leave of absence until I got my shit together. Without Tony, I really would have lost my mind, but fucking hell, I wish he would stop bringing this up. Ever the realist, I rubbed my temples in exasperation and told him of what seemed like the millionth time.
Jake is dead. His parents are dead. I wish they weren't, but...
The ringing of the doorbell cut me off. I recoiled from my chair like a frightened puppy and hid behind it. With the curtains drawn shut against the sun's rays, my lips trembled as I watched the front door, silently urging whoever or whatever it was to leave us the hell alone. This was how low I'd sunk. I'd never felt so pathetic. There was a knock this time, followed by a familiar voice.
Hello, this is Lucas James Drury. I need to speak with you.
It was the policeman who'd rescued us. Relaxing a little, I replied timidly.
What do you want?
Look, I understand why you don't trust me. You barely know me, but you are the only one I can talk to about this. Everyone else thinks I'm crazy.
Tony rose up without even looking at me to admit him, sealing the door as soon as he crossed the threshold.
Aren't you on duty?
I asked the big man, noticing his casual attire. He shifted uncomfortably.
I lost my job. They said I was over-obsessed with this case. And that face hasn't been easy to forget. Which leads me to why I'm here. I need to ask both of you some questions.
He took a seat on the couch at my invitation.
Now, you boys said that there were 3 figures in total, correct?
We nodded. We brought James up to speed on everything we knew. His face appeared solemn as we told him about Jake's parents. My heart sank.
You don't believe us, do you?
Before James could utter a response, the doorbell rang once more.
Hello, this is Officer Drury. I need to speak with you.
As you can imagine, in my fragile state, I damn near shat myself. There was a long moment of confused silence before the doorbell rang again. James appeared wide-eyed with shock as he whispered,
Quick, through the back door.
I led the way out into a small back garden, vaulting over the chest-high fence to the side.
Don't you have a gun?
Tony hissed at James as his giant form landed with surprising dexterity.
Didn't you hear me? I lost my job. You think they let me keep the gun?
My car's in the street out front. We could cut back through the alleyway and try to sneak over by it.
I suggested, hoping someone had a better idea. They each nodded in agreement. Great. We edged quietly along the side wall of my rented house. Upon reaching the corner, I held my breath and took a peek. At the foot of my front door stood a perfect imitation of the man beside me, speaking reassuringly to the door in an effort to coax us outside. It wore identical clothes to the James standing next to me, the only visible difference being that the one in the door held a huge carving knife behind its back, glimmering in the midday sun. We ducked behind the low brick wall lining the front porch, and kept one eye on the creature as we began to shuffle along. In an instant, its head snapped to face us and the knife was hidden from view. Brow crinkled, it looked of concern. It said,
Boys, get away from him. That isn't me.
He slowly made his way forwards, ushering us towards him while watching James carefully.
Run!
Screamed James, pushing us ahead of him. I've never run so hard in my life. We closed the gap to my car in no time at all. Fumbling to fish the keys from my pocket, fucking skinny James, I looked back to see James' doppelganger pounding towards us with monstrous speed. The doors finally opened. We piled into my second-hand 4x4, and I wasted no time getting the engine started. All of a sudden, glass was bouncing off every surface as the creature punched an arm through the rear window. It grabbed a hold of James by the back of his neck and pulled him back from inside the car with inhuman strength. James writhed in fear as the creature held his head to face us. We could only watch back in horror as its face split into a grotesque grin, and bulging eyes never leaving mine, drew its blade across James's throat. The world turned red as blood sprayed over the car's dark interior. The thing's head began to roll as it started to giggle uncontrollably. As James's limp body fell to the floor, the creature's gaze slid down to the blood-slicked pile of meat, hunger in its eyes. Its lips peeled back over its pointed teeth, widening further than should be possible, as it knelt out of sight. Blue mingled with red as cars flashed past the window. The next thing I knew, a paramedic was gently prying my hands from the steering wheel. As I sat in the rear of the ambulance, a flashlight shining in my eyes, I caught a glimpse of the gory aftermath scattered across the road. It looked as though it had been well into its meal before the police arrived. The creature's body lay draped over the beet red chunks that used to be James. Blood from countless bullet wounds still running freely. I just can't shake the nightmare from seeing that twisted face towards me. Even in death, its mouth stretched wide in a blood-caked grin that crinkled those horribly glassy eyes, mocking me with a face full of sickening happiness. It had been an elderly gentleman who phoned the police. He'd heard the commotion outside and witnessed the entire thing through the front window of his house in broad daylight. Poor guy. The legitimacy of our version of events no longer in question, the police were forced to investigate Jake's family. One troubled police officer later gave me a brief insight of what took place. Apparently, they questioned each family member right there in the living room. It being something of an exceptional case, they cooperated without hesitation, until someone found the discarded bones pile in the bathtub. In the officer's own words,
Then they burst out laughing, as if they'd been holding it in all along. Their heads rolled around so fast, I felt sick just watching them. When some of the boys tried to restrain them, they lashed out. Hit one fella so hard he sailed clean across the room. After that, we started shooting. You wouldn't believe how long they stayed standing, giggling through it all they were.
It's been close to a year now. I'm slowly moving on, taking each day as it comes. I don't see much of Tony these days. He skipped town a few months back. I'll be doing the same myself as soon as I can scrape some money together. I'm not sure if I'm just being paranoid. It's definitely not out of the question, but some people here have been acting really strange. Just the other day, I walked into the gas station during the early hours of the morning. After paying the cashier, she cocked her head to one side, smiled real wide.
Thanks, have a great day.
Glancing back on the way out, I caught her staring at the wall, grin still fixed in place, head rolling violently. She stopped as soon as she saw me watching.
Something wrong, sir?
I know it's probably just my imagination, and a polite cashier isn't that strange, I guess. But still, I think I'd better move.
Ha ha ha!